Good afternoon. Welcome to our PD series. My name is Dinizulu Washington. I am the interim director at UChicago UTEP, the Urban Teacher Education Program. We are so happy and excited to have so many of you join us for our third session in this PD series. We originally initiated this series due to the uncertain times that we're currently in. There's so much going on in the world right now. We are in the midst of a global pandemic. We are in a city that's seeing racial tension and division that have been present since the birth of this country, really coming to a boiling point. In the midst of all of this, we have to teach. My message each week has been the same. Teachers are essential during this time. Teachers help students navigate and make sense of the current reality, and teachers have the privilege and responsibility to empower our youth to be the change that they wish to see in their communities. We hope that this series provides teachers with the resources and supports needed to help them carry out their jobs at the highest levels. Our first two sessions were powerful. If you missed them, the recordings will be on our website. Dr. Joel Jackson and Dr. Micere Keels focused on self-care strategies because in order to do the complex work of helping others, we have to make sure we are taking care of ourselves and are in the best place to help our students. Last week's session with Dr. Kei Fujioshi focused on the idea of anti-racist teaching and the ongoing process of reflection, learning, and unlearning that has to take place in order to really see our students and the strengths that they bring to us in the classroom. I'm very excited about today's session with Dr. Micere Keels and Dr. Sonya Mathies Dinizulu, where they will share their expertise in trauma-informed practices in the classroom. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping reminders. One, we want everyone to know that this is a recorded session meant to be shared so that if there are teachers that could not be present today, they will still have access to the information. This training will be posted online in the future. Also, for those educators that are seeking CPDUs for attending today, there'll be a link in the chat towards the end of the training where you'll find the evaluation form, which includes your email address. After completing this, the certificate of completion form will be sent to you for your records. Attendees can also elect the closed captioning feature by clicking the icon, the gray icon at the bottom of the screen. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the members of our planning team for helping put this together. Our Dean, Deborah Gorman-Smith, who has led the charge in creating this series. Our members, Adrian Talbert, Dwayne Davis, Maggie Walsh, Carmela and Sewell, and Sid, who are also in charge of technology for this session. I also want to make sure to thank and acknowledge the Clement and Jesse V. Stone Foundation, who is funding this initiative so that we can provide this training to teachers free of charge. With no further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Micere Keels, who will begin this session for us.
And I'm muted again, as usual. So, Micere Keels here. You'd think by now I could figure out how to start these things without talking to myself. But once again, happy to be here with all of you. Although Tanisha noted that I am starting the session, I'm more just welcoming you guys to this presentation and saying that I'm very happy to be here again with you guys today and looking forward to this conversation. I do think that it will be helpful. And for a big part of this conversation today, we will be problem solving together. So this really is a working session in many ways. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sonya Mathies Dinizulu, who will truly give you some initial content for this session.
Great, thank you, Micere. Welcome everybody. I'm so glad to be a part of this series. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the slides. Is that okay with you, Micere? Yes, we're good? Okay. So give me a second. And okay, let me go back to the beginning. Okay, so just a reminder, this topic is focusing on supporting student learning and healing through trauma responsive teaching practices. And before we want to talk a little bit more about how to do this work, we need to really focus on the context. And the context that I think we all are not surprised about, we all know what this context is talking about. But the way I would like to introduce this context of looking at COVID-19, racial trauma, and all of the other things that come with going through racial trauma, that the things that lead up to racial trauma, the things that have led up to the COVID-19 and some of the inequalities we have seen, I would like to introduce this concept called syndemics. And Merrill defines syndemics as something that is involving an adverse interaction of diseases, which is usually two or more of any kind. It could be infections, it could be chronic non-communicable diseases, even mental health, and conditions of inequalities caused by social, environmental, structural, and or political factors such as poverty, structural violence, stigma. So this interaction further exacerbates the disease burden. So when we talk about syndemics present day, like what is going on today, we have COVID-19. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in upcoming slides, but COVID-19, we know that there's a huge disparity in terms of who is contracting it, as well as who is really experiencing the effects, the downside of experiencing COVID-19, meaning Black and brown people are the ones who are experiencing mortality and morbidity related to COVID-19. And then on top of that, so we have, and plus, so if they have pre-existing medical conditions and COVID-19, so those are two different types of diseases that will further complicate their medical condition. But on top of that, and we all know this already, racial trauma is another added layer that has been experienced by Black and brown people in this country. So when you have the social context mixed with the medical, it really makes it more complicated for that person to recover from the medical experiences that they're going through. And in addition to the social experiences or environmental structural barriers that people are facing. So hopefully that makes sense. So when we talk about syndemics, I really like to think of it, some people refer to it as pandemic, but I want to add more of a health, medical, anthropological point of view that we should consider. Syndemics is something that I think is still new to people, and hopefully this is something that if you've heard of it, great. If you haven't, hopefully this is something you guys can walk away with. But it's a useful framework, again, in understanding how these types of interacting epidemics can develop under conditions of health and social disparities. So like I said, the current day syndemics that we're experiencing are health disparities among people who are experiencing COVID-19. And then when we talk about COVID-19 and mental health and racism, people are experiencing racial trauma, anxiety, depression, behavioral dysregulation, emotional dysregulation. So we understand, like I mentioned before, that the historical and present day factors that have created the syndemic conditions within Black Americans are experiencing the lethal force of COVID-19. And this includes racism, this includes the effects of slavery, this includes the redlining, political gerrymandering, voter suppression through the mail that's going on right now, employment discrimination, health discrimination, and even education, right? We have laws to integrate our schools, but particularly as we see in Chicago, schools are really separated and it's not equal, right? So these can further complicate some of the issues that we're experiencing within families and students and teachers who are experiencing the effects of COVID-19 on top of that. So the effects, I want to, again, bring in some of the health perspective. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work with children and families exposed to trauma and violence. That's my specialization. But as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, as a clinical psychologist, I can't, not talk about these things because I think it is going to be important to what we're going to talk about later. But physical safety, when we talk about COVID-19, it's not only about death, but we have to think about things that people are losing. We have to think about things that people are really anxious about. So physical sense of safety, of course, worrying about contracting the virus, worrying about the death of a loved one from the virus, worrying about recovering from the virus if you were to contract it, because some people have lost loved ones unexpectedly, people you never thought they were healthy, and then all of a sudden they're not here anymore. Quality of life. So again, it could be Grief and loss could be also related to quality of life. So people may not be job secure or food secure anymore like they once were when they were employed, but COVID-19 has changed a lot of that for people. Lack of educational needs. I'm working with a lot of parents who are worried about their kids who have 504 plans and IEP plans, and they're worrying about, you know, how am I supposed to replicate what schools can do, normally do, but I can't do this at home. Compromised social networks, isolation, and of course, uncertainty of the future. Some people, it's really hard to tolerate the unknown, and it's something we're just going to have to do. So some of the mental health symptoms that may come from that, and again, as I mentioned before, we want to pay really good attention to those particular groups, racial ethnic groups, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So BIPOC is the acronym that is often used. We really, really want to pay attention to those students, to those families, to those teachers even, that they're affected, going to be more affected and experience more disparities than probably any other group that we know of. So we have to be careful of, or being aware of that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, again, social isolation, loneliness, dealing with emotional and behavioral dysregulation, low self-esteem, increased substance use. I've seen some of that with some of my teenagers, more use of marijuana is what I'm seeing mostly. Grief, suicidal ideation. And again, like I mentioned before, the exacerbated learning disabilities and mental health conditions that interfere with learning is something I'm also seeing, and parents and other caretakers are also struggling with. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Keels to give us a little bit more of an introduction of what we're going to talk about in terms of a trauma responsive model that works for educators. And Micere, let me know if you want me to advance the slide for you.
Yes, thank you very much. So the kind of two things that we're going to focus on the remainder of our time with you today is really trying to move towards thinking of what you need to do in your school and in the classroom in this virtual space, as well as practices that you yourself can think of what you need to do in your, I think for most of us, virtual classroom, remote classroom, but they're also acknowledging there may be some of you that will still be in either a hybrid context or in-person context, because with Zoom, we can be zooming in from anywhere in this moment in time. And so the first that we want to just go through fairly quickly is thinking of this more on like a school-wide level and broad conceptual level of what it is that kids need. So you can go to the next slide. And so the first is kind of this box that everything is contained in, which is prevention and management of secondary traumatic stress, which is why we started a couple of weeks ago with educator self-care. Because essentially, if we can't care for ourselves as educators, and if we can't regulate ourselves, it's going to be really difficult to provide care for our students and to help our students self-regulate. So that is kind of why prevention and management of secondary traumatic stress really is key, and to really think about what you're doing as caring for yourself as part of caring for your students. It's not putting your students' needs aside in order to care for yourself. That is part of making sure that you can show up for them. And so on the next, you can advance. We think about mindfulness for all, and that's mindfulness for all means mindfulness for the teachers, the educators, as well as students, because it helps you to manage your stressors, as well as if you are practicing mindfulness yourself and you can see the benefits of it for yourself, you're then able to share it with and teach it to your students. And remote learning is actually a good context to do mindfulness with students. It's not just something that you need to do in the in-person context. And part of that is because you have so much less control in remote learning about the context that they're in. And so starting synchronous learning, for example, with mindfulness videos, and there are lots of really amazing 2-minute, 3-minute, 5-minute, 15-minute mindfulness videos that span all grade and age levels, that starting your remote learning class by sharing that with all of your students and getting all of your students to engage in that brief mindfulness practice, it's a way to bring them all into this virtual space, and gets them all settled before you begin whatever lesson, whatever instruction you're going to do. And so it actually in many ways becomes more important in virtual learning as a way to kind of say, let's all come to this space together. And you can go on to the next one, which is safety, that we break down into physical, psychological, and emotional safety. And physical safety still matters in this remote learning context. You just are engaging with it in a very different way, in that it's still going to be really important. And my project, Track Project, we're working on a brief on how you can think about and recognize signs of a lack of safety in the remote learning context, because these will require different skills. Still trying to figure out what those skills are. But it's still going to matter to think about whether your students are in a safe space, even if they're not in the physical classroom context with you. Again, you have even less control over the space that they're in, but you still have mandatory reporting requirements. And if students are not in a physically safe space, their brains and their bodies are not going to be in a learning space, even if they may be in front of you in the camera, or they may be logging in and downloading whatever assignments are sent to them. Psychological safety is the discipline aspect of what we do. And I have to say, truly amazed to hear that there are instances of expelling students from and suspending students from the virtual classroom that happened in spring, in spring of this year. And that is quite troubling, that many of the things that happened in person, we have transferred to this virtual space. And so we still need to think about how we talk to kids and how we talk to them about their behaviors, how we as the educators set the protocols and set the structures and set the permissions on devices and on our interactions, so that we can minimize the opportunities, I guess you could say, that we create for acting out behaviors. We're still in that same context of that we are setting the structure, that we are setting that environment for kids. And also thinking about the fact that, again, because we have so little control over their physical context and we have less knowledge of what it is that they're experiencing, there's so much greater patience that is required of us as educators in this virtual learning space. And it is going to be so easy for us to do and say things that will make kids feel disconnected from this virtual learning space. And so we really need to think that even in this virtual learning space, that we are communicating to kids that they are wanted in this space, and that we will help them develop the behaviors and help them develop the procedures and practices that allow them to continue to engage in this virtual space, and not getting frustrated with them when they mess up in this virtual space, because it's new for all of us. And they may initially think that they engage in this space the way they engage in all the other virtual spaces with their friends. And so we, again, have to teach them and set those protocols. Emotional safety, we talk about that as the learning climate of the classroom. So how do we get kids to kind of believe and understand that they are all in this kind of learning environment together, that we are still creating a learning community, even though we're in our individual spaces. And again, this is one of those things that's even more important in the virtual learning space, because we feel so isolated that we have to do quite a bit of work to kind of say, yes, we're in our individual spaces, but we're still in a learning community. And so that's really critical that we think about spending extra time. I know that it's been said here and there, but saying it again, extra time at the beginning of this academic year building a virtual learning community among students, because many of us will be entering classrooms in this virtual space with kids we've never met before. And so we really going to have to be patient with ourselves and with our students and spend time and work building that community so that they can feel emotionally safe as learners. Go on to the next one. So strong relationships for all. We put after safety, just because if people don't have at least an initial sense of safety, it's going to be really hard to build a relationship. Although relationship building is a big part of safety. Much of what we do to create safety is about relationship building, but just also paying really strong attention to the fact that the statement that is always made that kids don't care to learn from you until they understand and believe that you care. And so as you're thinking about the learning environment, and as we're feeling pressured to catch up from whatever learning was missed last year, it's going to be really, really critical to, again, have a relational focus on this. And one of the things that we are initially learning, so again, as my project, we're digging into some of the research on remote learning, that's long-standing research on remote learning. And one of the things coming up in that research is the relationship is a huge part of kids showing up in this remote learning environment. So in physical classroom, you know, they had to at least have their bodies there, but in this remote space, it's just not the same. And so that relationship is really critical for one of the motivating reasons for why they're going to show up. And so particularly for kids who completely dropped off the radar last year, we're going to need to spend some extra time and support in that relationship building piece, and spending some time on probably some one-on-one phone calls in order to build a relationship to get them to show up in the classroom space. And then you can just go to the last one. And we're not going to talk much, probably very little about this today, but lastly, just it's really critical that social and emotional learning is integrated into core curriculum and instruction, which means when you're teaching math, when you're teaching language arts, social studies, science, all of that stuff, that you're also thinking about what aspects of social and emotional learning, what aspects of interpersonal learning need to be included and can be included as part of that core curriculum and instruction, so that SEL is not something that happens over there and I'm going to go teach math over here, and when I get some time I'll go back and teach some SEL. But how do we make sure that even in math time we're thinking of what are some interpersonal relationship building skills that are needed to make this math class effective? And for all of these things, kids coping with trauma are going to need direct and intentional support for all of these things. It's not just gonna come naturally. And even for other kids, it doesn't come naturally. It's just that their parents do it at home. And so they bring that with them into the school context. All right, so that's it for just kind of that overview of the model. And then going into the next slide, where Sonya and I will spend the bulk of our time having a conversation about practices. So you can go into that.
I want to add to this too, Micere, that that these are again very grounded in what we do in trauma therapy. Like, again, I'm not in the classroom, I'm in the office seeing patients or clients, but these are some of the best practices of how we deal with trauma if they were coming for therapy. But the thing I want to highlight is that all that you're mentioning, even if the kid doesn't have trauma, these are still really good practices. So you have to keep them like this is like very much of a universal type of prevention intervention framework that Micere is introducing. So I really do appreciate that, you know, the first line of defense when we talk about trauma, you have to have a sense of safety. Otherwise, everything else that you build upon it will just crumble if the child doesn't feel safe. So if a kid doesn't have a trauma background, but they're worried about COVID-19, this still is very, very much relevant to them. So I still see it applying to any kind of kid that is in your classroom. You don't know where the kids are coming from. You don't know all that's happening at home. So it's nice to know that you can still use these strategies or have this type of mindset or framework to use with these kids, but also paying attention to those kids. And we'll talk about screening possibly those kids who have trauma. But you know, paying a little bit more attention to those kids who may have a trauma background or experiencing grief and loss. So I wanted to highlight that.
Yeah,
all right.
Thank you. Yeah. And then we can go to the next one. We're now going to really just use this graphic for most of the remainder of our time as a way to organize our conversation. And so, which is based on the 4 R's of trauma, which is a model not developed by us. It's a very well-known and standard model. All we've done is really thinking about some of the components of the model in the ways that it matters for educators and for schools. And the first component is realizes. So what do you need to realize and understand and really get into part of your knowledge base in order to help you as you are then engaging with students coping with trauma. The first is realizing the brain science aspects of this. And we're not going to go into any details at all of the brain science of this today. But really largely here, it's just what we want to acknowledge is that the things that we're talking about, the strategies that are suggested, the behavioral challenges that are talked about, they're all based on a very solid, strong foundation of neurobiological research that informs us of the things that happen to your brain and your body under stress and under chronic stress and under stress where you either don't have time to recover from one stressor to the next, or you don't have social supports in order to help you recover, to help you process the information. Under those conditions, trauma, psychological and emotional and spiritual trauma can result, leaving a lingering psychological wound. And it is that kind of lingering wound that is then expressed in the behaviors that show up in your classroom. And so it's really just to note that we're not trauma responsive, trauma informed, trauma sensitive models and practices are not based on just like guessing at what might be happening, but there's really a solid foundation of research on what is happening in the brain and body for why that kid either bolts out of the classroom often, hides under a desk when you make small requests, and also something like why particular kids ask for a drink of water to go out to the water fountain 20 times a day. It's not to frustrate you, it's because they are anxious and they just need to escape the classroom for a few minutes in order to calm their anxiety. And one of the ways that they can escape the classroom is asking for a drink of water. Even though you're thinking like, I know this kid is doing this just to piss me off because they know one of my rules is you can get 3 drinks of water, you know, in a particular period of time. And here they are for the 5th time asking for a drink of water. It is because what they're feeling and experiencing is extensive anxiety and they don't know how to communicate that to you. And so one of the things that they know that can get them out of the classroom is to go get a drink of water. And so here they are again. And so it's really trying to, when we talk about these things, saying there's something happening in the brain and body of the kid, and this is their way of expressing it. And also that almost everyone, human being, unless they are very mentally and emotionally disturbed, attempt to meet the expectations of whatever context they're in. So if an individual is not meeting the expectations of that context, there is something meaningfully happening inside that we need to get to the bottom of. And so, Sonya, do you have anything else on that or any of the other three?
Yeah, I definitely want to add. So on everything that you said, please, everyone keep that in mind. And on top of what Micere had mentioned, the development. So a child's development, when we think of a child development, we have to think of their cognitive capacity, their language, their problem solving. So the executive functioning piece of their brain, which is problem solving, emotional regulation, behavioral regulation. We have to think about their biology, like what they're born with. And we also have to think about, yeah, I think I mentioned all the different areas of development. So language and physical development, obviously, that's the other part I was forgetting. So when we talk about, you know, kids under a lot of stress, the brain, the neuroscience definitely supports that development can be affected. And so to Michere's point of someone not having the language or the capacity to express their verbally, to express their anxiety around whatever they're experiencing, it comes across as a behavior of just, I want to get a drink of water, but the teacher might misperceive it as something else. So it's not so much about why you're, how you're doing it. Let's try to look at like what's going on, why you're asking this over and over again, kind of playing Columbo around this and not just getting to the point of like, what's wrong with you, but what's going on, like really try to dig deep and figure out like what's going on. But for some kids, you know, the emotional and dysregulation or behavioral dysregulation, some kids may talk back, some kids may just mute you or get off Zoom, and whatever the case may be. Again, instead of trying to come from like, what's wrong with this kid? Don't they understand that this is what they're supposed to do? Yeah, they understand that, but do you understand what their needs are and how you can be responsive to it? So I think keeping in mind those aspects of development of, again, of language, cognitions, executive functioning, such as problem solving, behavior, emotional, behavioral regulation, and then they're just the physical development of their bodies, you know, is all definitely supported behind neuroscience that can drive into certain behaviors that are definitely repetitive and may be perceived as problematic. But again, we want to understand like, why is this really happening and how much of their context is playing a role. So I hope that makes sense.
Yep. And then I'll also let you lead off on one of the other two.
Sure. So the intersections of inequality and trauma. So it's kind of like what the context we introduced earlier. I think the one thing, I'm not going to repeat what I said earlier, but again, we know that there's disparities in terms of the types of trauma that experience. When it comes to community violence, we know it's mostly Black and brown families, and we know it's mostly in communities that are very much under-resourced, and don't have a lot of opportunities. So we understand where this is happening, how we can solve it. We know how to solve it. It's just a matter of people trying to make the efforts to solve these issues. And so, you know, I guess the type of thing I want to add on top of the inequalities and trauma is, you know, not everybody experiences trauma the same way. Like not everybody's going to experience racial trauma or COVID-19 the same way. But just understand that, you know, we want to look for resilience in families. We want to be able to look for their strengths and being able to use those opportunities to capitalize on either more engagement with families, or student participation. So hopefully you can see, not from a deficit approach, even though these intersections are problematic and we do need to pay attention and be responsive to it, but at the same time, hopefully that your lens can come from a strength-based approach. So if the student is really strong in doing something, hopefully you can use that opportunity for that student to shine in this virtual setting. I know there might be some people who are doing in-person classroom teaching as well. So in whatever setting that is, it's really important to think about what are the strengths that we can pull from.
And then last, when we think about assumptions and biases, it is just really critical that we each find a way to, I guess, in this context, we one challenge with this context is that we're not going to have a lot of feedback from others around the things that we're doing. So that is going to be a particular challenge in this context. But one of the things, for example, that we ask teachers to think about in the in-person context is if they're having a problem with a particular child, oftentimes there's some other adult in the school, another teacher or someone in a different position that maybe doesn't have those challenges and experiences with that child. And so that is somebody that they can check in with in order to see what's working with them, or how do they understand that child, or how are they seeing things, or what have they been able to learn to then use in their interactions with that child that we may not have been able to see because of our own assumptions and biases that have led to the lens that we use when we're seeing a particular child. And also just keeping your own track of the data of what's happening in your classroom, and to think about when there's any kind of disproportionality with regards to who is receiving disciplinary responses from you, be it by gender, by race and ethnic origin, by language, English language status, or by any ability statuses or any other things like that, that it is often the case that those are interactional issues between our assumptions and biases and what the child brings with them into the classroom, that are highlighting particular aspects of that interaction that's not working. And rarely is it ever it's not really, it is never an issue of just the student or just the teacher, but it is the interaction between the two. And so whenever there are any particular students, where the relationship or the classroom experience ends up particularly conflictual, or it is that it trends towards boys or towards girls or towards Black boys or Black girls or any other group in your classroom, it's really critical to be able to be self-reflective of our assumptions and biases and taking that step back to see what might be happening here. When we talk about at the end, we'll talk about re-traumatization, but our assumptions and biases can really end up creating a classroom context that is re-traumatizing and is a layering on the existing disparities that are already out there. And so one of the things that we want to do for each of these, the 4 R's, is to essentially kind of pose a question to all of you and give you a moment to be able to reflect on it for a couple minutes. Just do take a minute or two to really reflect on the questions, and then write something of the reflection in the chat, and then take a moment to look at some of the chat responses of the other participants in the meeting, because it's really important to have these moments of, particularly in this virtual learning space, when we're all in our individual spaces, these moments of collective discussion so that we are learning from each other. And with this one, kind of the realizing really thinking back to what Sonya said about the syndemic and where we are in this current moment, and the overlapping aspects of schools being closed for so many months, and kids being in a context that, many of them being in a context that didn't regulate or reinforce kind of classroom expectations in person or learning, meaning that they weren't kind of that structured, regularized context. So schools being closed, many of those kids being in families and neighborhoods that were economically challenged. And so that there's a stressor there, and many of those families that were kind of on the cusp may have lost jobs and be plunged into increasing stress. There are also all too many that have actually lost caregivers to the virus, as well as, there was one other, just all of the issues of social and political unrest that has happened in the US over these many months. And unfortunately, the coming political unrest as we enter into this election season, thinking about what are the things that you're going to need to, some of the things that you're going to need to keep in mind to ask, when you ask yourself that question, what might be going on? What might this student be experiencing that might be behind challenging behaviors that I see in the classroom, in person or virtual, that go beyond there's something wrong with you. What is happening, what might be going on, what are things that I might need to probe for, to find ways to ask about or to learn more about, so that I can get a deeper context beyond the surface behavior that I might see. So to just think about what are some of these many additional reasons and things that you need to understand that might be happening for any particular individual child, that is the underlying cause of the acting out behavior, where you need to get some of that information so that you can know how to help them. Do you have any clarifications or anything you want to add to that, Sonya?
No, this is great.
Okay, so I'll give you guys, have my timer on, 2 minutes to just think. One more minute.
The client here down a couple.
Okay. So I'll let you guys now start putting your kind of comments and thoughts into the chat, and then also reading some of your fellow participants. So regarding the couple of comments about anxiety, one of the things that we recommend is that all of you plan to start the year talking about COVID-19 and what has happened in order to create some common understanding between you and your students about what it is that's happened. Otherwise, we don't know what they think about what's happened, their child level understanding of what it is that's occurring. We don't know how much adult support they've received to process this information. And so by you doing that with them at the beginning of the year, you will at least have some understanding of what's been this shared understanding of the kids in between you and your classroom, and you can work from there.
Yeah, Micere, I totally agree with you, and would like to add, I think COVID-19, even though there's a lot of, negative consequences coming from it, but I think some of the positive unintended consequences, or maybe intended, because that's what we're trying to intentionally do, is set a safe space for kids to tolerate their anxiety. We can't predict the future. Like COVID-19, there are things that we just cannot predict. We just cannot. But what we can do is set up opportunities for our kids to feel, and this, I feel like this is going into the response section once we get to that fourth R or the third R, whichever R number that is. But anyways, it's coming up. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that one of the ways to manage anxiety is by providing a safe space and something that is predictable. Because we can't predict COVID-19, but I know when I come to so-and-so's class at this time on this day, I know that I'm going to expect a safe space and something that's going to help me feel more connected and help me feel hopefully less anxious. So I think them developing a mindset for them is really important as well. But again, I appreciate everybody's comments of recognizing that anxiety is going to, more than likely, if not, play a role in some of their presentations. Okay, we have a lot more. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you guys. And if you're still typing, finish your sentence and they'll just kind of populate into the chat that you'll be able to look back on. We will go to the next R. Oh, right.
Not about this. Well, okay.
Yeah, we can keep going.
Yeah, we'll keep going next time.
Okay. The next R is recognizing. So it's important that we learn how to recognize and identify student dysregulation early, oftentimes in the in-person space, and it's probably more so in this remote learning space, that kids are giving many signals that they are becoming increasingly dysregulated, but it either doesn't register fully with us, or we don't pay attention and respond to it until their behavior becomes so dysregulated that it demands a response from us. But generally at that time, our response, their behavior is so large and our response to it is so large that it just sets off a pattern of escalation in the moment. And what we're really trying to do when we talk about ability to identify student dysregulation is identify small signs and identify small signs early, when we can still intervene and have a conversation with them, or intervene and redirect them, rather than it being a big escalation aspect. And so anything else, Sonya, before we maybe think collectively about what we need to be looking for?
I think so. I appreciate that teachers have a lot to navigate, whether if it's in person or remote learning. There's a lot of multitasking, there's a lot of paying attention. So just give yourself permission that you may not always recognize everything in the moment. You have every right to be frustrated, but how you act out that frustration is what's going to matter. That's going to make or break a relationship. So I suggest figuring out ways to manage the frustration so that you can then put yourself in a position to help your students co-regulate, right? So this is something that came from another conference. I was on a panel with someone else, and she did such a beautiful job talking about how teachers can help their students co-regulate, and you modeling for the student. So even if, and this is a nice way to make it, again, more of a universal classroom experience. So that way, if you're missing anybody, and not being able to pay attention, because we talk about the kids who act out, the ones who are going to get the attention, but we have some internalizers, and you won't even see or nothing. They'll just won't say nothing. But that doesn't mean that they're not dysregulated. They're just not showing it, right? So we want to capture those students who are silent and retreating back. But I think it's really important, again, just going back to strategies that can lead to co-regulating with the student. That's also acknowledging, I'm feeling frustrated too, but this is how we're going to resolve this conflict together. Rather than just saying you get detention, or I'm going to write you up, or I'm going to talk to your parent about this. Co-regulate with the student. And maybe you guys can put some things in the chat as well about some ideas about how to co-regulate. But basically, you're getting to a level when your brain, this part of the brain, when people start to become dysregulated, the executive function part of your brain that requires thinking, planning, organization, problem solving, all of that may not be accessed. So being able to calm down, settle down, and you being able to co-regulate with even all of the students together is helpful. Sometimes you can have one or two disruptors in the classroom, and you know what? Instead of just focusing on those two, let's just say, you know what? Sounds like two people in the classroom need some additional support. So why don't we all do this together, right? And it may interrupt the lesson. You may not even finish the lesson. It's okay. It's COVID-19. We're just going to have to adapt. But so that's the only other added thing I wanted to contribute. Mm-hmm.
Agreed. And just to say a little bit, just to bring everybody in, because we're not necessarily sure who knows what co-regulation is or not, mm-hmm. is that co-regulation is when you use your own calm and your own self-regulation capacities in order to regulate somebody else who is still developing or is dysregulated themselves. So you can think about it as two adults, one way to think about it, two adults in a disaster. One of the things that you will sometimes see happening is one person who has been able to maintain a sense of calm in that disaster will co-regulate the other who has not been able to maintain a sense of calm. By, depending on their relationship, you can kind of touch that person. And if they are talking at this level, you keep talking at this level in an effort to bring them down to your level. And if their body postures and movements are very exaggerated and excited, you keep your movements very small and very low. And again, what you're doing in that context is that you are bringing them into your space of how to behave and how to respond in this context. And one of the ways that they say it is just like panic spreads, calm can also spread, but you have to hold it and you have to keep that calm, and then you have to share that calm. And by doing so, others will kind of regulate themselves down to where you are. And it's something that parents naturally do with kids as they're teaching them how to respond, because for some reason, most of us as kids come into this world with an overreaction, and it's evolutionary in that you come into the world as a baby just like flying all over the place when something goes wrong, because you can't do anything. You need attention. You need everybody to come help and save you. But as kids grow, we're kind of saying, okay, you just fell and got a teensy bitsy scrape. You're gonna be okay. And that's what you're doing, co-regulating in the classroom for kids who react or have a very emotional outbursts. You are saying, by me staying calm, by me showing you this way of responding, they will come down to that space. And so that's you co-regulating as a teacher. And it's one of the strongest recommendations for how to de-escalate a situation. It's not easy, it's hard, because what you want to do and what's instinctive is to also get big and get loud, but doing the opposite is actually what brings situations down. And so that's co-regulation. And a big part of co-regulation, as Sonya said, is first recognizing how you actually feel. Like, I'm feeling frustrated, or I'm feeling scared, or I'm feeling angry. You need to recognize that in order to then regulate yourself and regulate the students. And so what we really want to do now is really think about, in this remote learning context, how the heck are we going to transfer some of these practices? And one way is, the first is being able to, in early stages, recognize signs of dysregulation. And I will admit to you, Sonya and I talked about this before, we don't have a good list of things for you to look for. And what we wanted to do was work with you guys and problem solve and think about, if you think back to this spring, when you were in any remote teaching, either through things that were communicated in an asynchronous context, or things that were communicated during times when you had synchronous interaction, were there any things that popped up for you that either in that moment or looking back on it were things that were signals or identifiers or signs of potential or student dysregulation, or challenges that were the student may have been experiencing but not verbalizing? And so that's really kind of an open question we want to put out and share in this moment of discussion. If anybody has any thoughts and ideas, or anything they experience that help them now think about coming into this fall.
I was gonna bring up in the chat, there's a response from Rachel Winborn about the virtual environment and what is seen here this last.
I see that, yeah.
And so I definitely agree with that. The disengage, like in the virtual classroom, a lot of what it looks like is just disengaged. Then it's just, they're not there.
Agreed.
I'm Rachel, and I say that because, if I can add one tiny thing, I'm a mom of 4 kids. I've had to e-learn 3 of them at home. 2 of them have IEPs. So I'm a parent on the other side of all this. I'm also I'm a incoming AM graduate student at SSA as well. And so, I mean, I think as a mom who has homeschooled, but also is trying to do 3 different e-learning platforms with her children, I've seen this, like, in the home environment, in the virtual, trying to be in a virtual classroom. Does this make sense? I'm seeing it on the other side of it. But, and I've also seen how the special education schools that my 2 kids go to, how they've tried to mitigate this. And part of the way they do it is they break up, they have smaller classrooms, so you can pull out into different, I don't know if Google can do it, but I know 2 of my kids run Zoom, and so you can pull into different Zoom rooms. And can I just ask a really quick question, you guys? Is this trauma response educator specifically for teachers, or is this also for social workers? This
Oh, go ahead.
webinar, you know what I'm asking?
Oh, the webinar.
Like what you guys are presenting to us right now. Because here's my question. And this is my brilliance into the future. This is what I hope for public education is, I think all classrooms, special education or not, should all be co-taught with at least one social worker. And then the teacher can have the real brilliance and the know-how of the curriculum. And then the social worker, clinician, or whatever, can do everything that you're presenting here. That's my 2 cents. I will shut up now.
No.
So I would love to see that. And we talk about it in our schools that we coach about pushing into the classroom, getting the social, emotional, social work staff, psychologists in spending time in the classroom. But until a long distant future, when they fund many more of you, it's largely not technically feasible. So we really, in many ways, are talking to teachers and saying, trying to help you figure out how to see and recognize these things among all of the other things that you're trying to do simultaneously. So it's really challenging. The way we talked about it in the in-person classroom was you have to move throughout the classroom. You have to just really move because you need to, and now that's is all up in the air and changed how things, even in an in-person classroom, but you need to move around and being able to interact with and get some information on students. You can't do it when you're just at the front of the classroom and everybody's at a distance from you. So that's one aspect, yes. So, but I do agree, kids leaving the remote learning space is a huge aspect of it. And so then you need to think about what is your in-person individual check-in going to be? It could be asynchronous, meaning some kind of email or quick survey or something that gets some kind of check-in to get some kind of information. But it's a lot of tracking down the kids who do simply leave or are still there, bodies there, but not in the way I saw my son do it, who was at that time last year was a sophomore in college, was he went, logged in, put his picture up, and then walked away and went back into bed. And I was just like, what just happened? And he was just like, I can't do it. I just can't look at this. This was in the first couple of weeks, and he was really dysregulated, having suddenly come back home, not wanting to be there, stressed about what's happening. And he was like, I just can't be in this class. Largely because the teacher was trying to replicate exactly what happened in person in the way that the lectures were done. And so what that helped me do when I started teaching with my students, because we started about a couple weeks after, there is always an engaging, interactive, communication, Zoom polls, whatever, something always interactive that's happening in the synchronous classes that I did, so that the kids, so that they know they couldn't just come and put their face up on the screen and walk away. Otherwise, because the way his teacher had no idea that his body was there, but he was not. We changed that very quickly. But his teacher would have had no idea. So we really do need to think about, are they really there in this virtual space?
I want to add to, we have to remember, we don't have any best practices around this, right? We are learning as we go. We're on the job training. So unfortunately, some students will not be connected. We can try everything in our power to make it, fantabulous, amazing. Maybe if you do TikTok more often, you might be able to reach them more. I don't know, you might have to step out of your comfort zone and engage social media a little bit more in your classroom. I have no idea. We don't have best practices around how do we do virtual classroom learning for kids? And this is why there's such, people keep saying we know that schools are best for learning. We know that. We know that virtual learning is not the best. So, and then on top of that, whatever restrictions or limits or demands that the schools are going to put on top of you is another thing that teachers have to deal with. And hopefully we'll give some pushback because you guys are on the ground, and it needs to be bi-directional feedback between administration and teachers to say, hey, this doesn't make sense. I can't teach for 90 minutes. It has to be 30 minutes of this and maybe 15 minutes of something else, of fun. The other piece too is the parents. We haven't talked about the parents yet, but I think it has to be a team-based approach. Some parents will engage, some parents may not engage. However, we can only do the best to try to make it really all-inclusive, invite everyone to have a space to talk about these things, you know, get feedback from the kids, get feedback from the parents about how to make this work better. I know with my son, he's going to 7th grade, but when he was in 6th grade during the COVID, the teacher can see the top of his head. All they saw was hair. But let me tell you, they didn't see what he was doing below. And I had to, you know, I had the opportunity to work from home, and I don't have to go in onto campus. But I can't, you know, I was able to monitor him, right? So, you know, I had to come up with a plan for him to say, you know, this is tough. I don't like being on Zoom either. I let him know that I'm on Zoom all day too, and it's hard for me to pay attention. I get it's hard for you to pay attention. So if you feel like you've had enough, I'm okay with you taking a break. But I want you to know that it's important for you to re-engage. So we need to come up with a way. If you need to take a break and walk away because it's natural, and I get it, it's Zoom, and we only have so much, but I need to work with you on how do we get you back to focusing on the content. And I let his teachers know. I'm like, my son cannot handle this. Don't expect him, don't hold him to these kind of standards because it's unrealistic. And I think we need to help our parents and advocate for them to advocate on the behalf of their children and talk to us and to administration about what's happening at home. So I think that's the other piece too.
Absolutely.
And hello?
Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to add, I agree with, is her name Rachel? I'm sorry if I can't remember, about having the social worker participate. I am a special education teacher, and during the first, the end of COVID, or not the end of COVID, the end of the school year when we went on remote learning, I had my social worker participate as much as she could in my sessions with my students and my teaching, because I told my students, this is more so, the gathering was SEL. So we talked about COVID. How is it affecting you? How is it affecting your family? Are you all okay? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you needed help with doing your assignments, I had tutoring sessions where they would come in. I would wait in the room, and they would come in, and we do whatever they needed to do to review the work that they had to do. But I agree, I wish we could do it all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple other things I guess I want to say to look for that Sonya actually in some ways stated. One of them, whenever you do have a synchronous class, is if you actually never see the student isn't making any attempt at eye contact is really weird on Zoom. Yeah. But you're like, I'm getting the sense that they're not actually here, even though their body's in front of you. It's just the hair that you're seeing, and they positioned the screen in such a way that is one kind of like, I need to check in with him or her, just to see what's happening, because there's no contact. And just the other thing to note is that you're doing this with kids that many of you may never have met in person, if you're starting the year out on Zoom. And so it's going to be important at times to do some check-ins with a previous teacher that they may have had or something like that, so you can get some information from someone who did have some in-person contact with that student before, that could help you out to understand what might be going on. This is really just going to be a year to tag team, I guess is what I would say, what's happening, or getting that social worker in to do a check-in and things like that. So yeah, it's going to be a lot that we will have to learn as we go this year. But the general kind of message is the need to be very vigilant, to try to ask questions, to look for signs. Whenever you're unsure, to get more information, so that so things don't escalate to the point where they either disappear completely from the virtual classroom, or they engage in some kind of acting out behavior in the virtual classroom, which is often for the same reason that they engage in active out behaviors in the physical classroom, which is that they have an unidentified, an unmet need, and they just are desperately trying to get somebody to see that they have a need. When they do this kind of work and surveys with students about acting out, many of them often say they don't do it intentionally, but when you can debrief and process with them after, it often is done, the acting out is done as an attempt to get somebody to pay attention to them. And kids know the best way and the fastest way to get adult attention is to act out inappropriately. And so oftentimes, just to think about, if any of you do have that experience this year of students engaging in acting out behaviors in your virtual classroom space, is imploring you to do everything possible to not go to any kind of suspending students from the virtual classroom environment, and to do a lot of work and digging to find out what might be happening.
And I want to add, because I know we have just less than 20 minutes left, but I think, I want to respond to a comment made about high schoolers in particular. Our teenagers are like, I really don't have to be here and I can totally just be gone. And my mom and dad is probably not home, So I think some of my research that I've done looking at working with kids who have strong pro-social behaviors, meaning that they are good problem solvers, they're good at socializing and engaging other kids, paired with kids who might have a little bit more deficits. So not only able to identify student dysregulation, but I think and again, that's from a trauma perspective, but let's also identify student regulation, like who are the students who are doing well. And then maybe for those high schoolers, this could be younger kids too, but I think for the high schoolers, having these breakout groups, I don't know, I have not used Google Classroom, I'm very familiar with Zoom. And having those spaces for them just to check in with each other or to do assignments, just like they would do in classroom. It's nice. I think students do like working together in a smaller pod, and the teacher's kind of just walking around and observing, and the teacher can hop in Zoom. You can go from one room to the next, to the next, to the next. You can visit these spaces and you don't even know, Lord knows, you don't know what they're actually doing because you're not there. But you want to build a sense of rapport and trust before you start introducing these kinds of, autonomous type of projects that they can go on their side. But that might be one way to help engage the high schoolers rather than just sitting and listening to instructor the whole time, but to maybe incorporate how to break up into pods a lot more often. So you guys, that's just an idea I have. I'm not a high school teacher, so that's just something I have. But on the ground doing community work in underserved communities, I've learned pairing kids who are, we have a lot of strengths in socializing with those kids who may not speak up as much or not be as strong, pairing those together, and those kids who are really strong could also maybe possibly help co-regulate, right? Or maybe we can give somebody like classroom leaders to do these kinds of things. So that can be applicable to high schoolers as well. That's just an idea.
You can go to the next one.
Next one? All right.
Yeah. Oh, and yeah. And I think click the next two so that they're all up on the screen. Yeah, thank you. And so this is just really thinking about what are some of the key things that we know about ways of responding that really help, that are really positive, meaning helping students move forward, students exhibiting behavior challenges move forward. And the first echoes everything so far, which is the first aspect of responding is that you are responding with teacher self-regulation. If you are dysregulated, all of that will transfer to everything that you are responding. So if you're dysregulated, the same words that you will say will come out and be experienced and interpreted very different if your behaviors and voice are dysregulated than if they're more calm and regulated, the exact same words. So that's just the one, which is why mindfulness Really, really, really important and key for teachers. Another way, as Joel talked about it, I think Joel did talk about it. Yes, he did in his presentation. That breath, even if it's just 1, 2, or 3 breaths, really makes a huge difference in what comes out of your mouth and the way in which it comes out of your mouth when something happens with challenging interactions with the student. Even just 1 deep breath can be beneficial. As Sonya mentioned, the next one is being strength-based. So especially when when it appears as though there are many things missing in a child's capacities, trying to figure out what is that thing that they aren't, what is that like 1 piece of the curriculum that they're engaged with, what is that 1 behavioral capacity that they have that's a strength that you can then start leveraging for all of the other things that you need to develop. Being able to identify at least 1 strength is huge, because the extent to which a student can feel mastery in the classroom in any 1 thing will help being able to transfer that feeling and that experience to other things. Consistency and predictability is just huge, as Sonya mentioned, part of creating safety. So again, that they know that at this time on this day, this will happen. And as the more that that's consistent and predictable, the more that they will show up into that space in a regulated way, versus if it's more chaotic or they're not quite sure, or it often gets canceled, or, you know, the more that starts in a predictable way and proceeds in a predictable way, that whatever class block time, the more the child's brain and body will automatically begin to regulate themselves for what is that expected predictable sequence. So there's behavior guidance, which just for us means to think about behavioral errors like you do academic errors. So whenever they're acting out, you're always, your first response is always one of, what do you want them to do? So, you know, they're in this remote learning space. You know, you keep hearing noise because they keep looking down and doing something on their phone. I mean, you have a pretty good idea that that's of what's happening. In that your response is not stop looking at your phone, stop playing that sound that's coming from your phone. Your response when we say behavior guidance is what is the replacement behavior that you can ask them to do away from that. So which is to say, I need you to open tab 24 in your Google Binder and do this. So what do I need to tell you that you need to do as much as possible to replace whatever it is that's the challenging behavior, the acting out behavior that is causing the problem, that you're always thinking about it from that frame. It's going to be much more helpful. Physical space, maintaining engagement, skill building of student self-regulation, and then want to turn it over to Sonya to maybe just talk a little bit about re-traumatization. Or if there's anything also in response that you want to talk about. I was just looking at the time.
Okay, nope. So yeah, I can talk about the re-traumatization and get into more, because I think people have the chat boxes going, so this is great. So we want to leave some time for that. But so again, I think it's so important. All 4 of these R's they don't work separate from one another. They really do have to work all together in order to be truly responsive. So to resist re-traumatization, what does that mean? This is basically ensuring that, you know, if a kid is coming in with some level of trauma, and let me say, most kids that I work with in high schoolers, they don't have PTSD, just because the PTSD diagnosis is still not child friendly, which is another conversation, another topic, and another problem. But either way, you know, they may still have some elements of traumatic stress, whether it's COVID-19 related, or just racial trauma, or a combination of 2, or just dealing with, you know, the structural violence that happens in many urban areas, and under-resourced communities. So they're, you know, some of these kids can be coming in with some of those traumatic stressors. And again, you may not always have the full context of the full picture, but just if you want to play, you know, err on the side of caution, an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure type of mindset, I think it's important to keep in mind that these kids may come in with some of these stressors, no matter what they might be, but they could come in with some of these stressors. And what are some of the ways that I can avoid re-traumatizing them? So it starts with, again, just realizing, recognizing, and being able to respond. What are some of the practices that schools have in place that, you know, may be fine for a kid who may not have a trauma, but will not be a good practice for kids who have been traumatized? So to the point that Micere mentioned earlier, I think, you know, I had one kid who was kicked out of the school like 30 something times and the school year wasn't even over. And this kid literally did have PTSD, but the school wasn't really responsive to this person. And so it took our team to educate and provide psychoeducation around what does trauma-informed care look like in a school setting. And it doesn't mean teachers have to be therapists. That's not what we're asking, but we're asking you to look at the practices, like this kid being kicked out all the time and feeling rejected and developing low self-esteem is something that can be prevented. Instead, what are those resources that the school can offer to help him, right? So, you know, you want to avoid people, you know, the traumatic stress symptoms being exacerbated because of school practices. And I think, again, being able to regulate yourself and then be able to regulate a child by using your own self, being able to manage your own self, and then being able to model for that child and help that child regulate even better. Looking at our kids from a strength-based approach. You know, I hate that commercial that talks about Huntington learning, your kids, a COVID slide, the learning slide. Kids are learning in COVID, let me tell you. If it's not academics, they're learning something, and that is a missed opportunity if we don't capitalize on it. So Huntington learning, sorry, my daughter, I'm teaching, sweetie. Okay, yeah, no. Okay, so COVID, you know, COVID-19, our kids are definitely learning. So just keep that in mind. Sorry, I'm just caught off guard because I didn't think my daughter would come in. I have just a few more minutes, hang tight. Okay, so you want to try to resist traumatization. You want to look at what are some of the practices that, again, that might need to be adjusted for those kids that you are quite well aware of who have some traumatic stress symptoms that they might be experiencing. And even if you're not sure about some of those kids, I think it's safe to say that for any kid who's coming back to in-person learning or remote learning, there's going to be some level of stress. And how do you want to not try to add to the additional stress? I think is something really important to think about a little bit more carefully. Community of learners, community of teachers, all really getting together and really figuring out what are some systematic ways that we could make sure that we don't further traumatize our kids. So hopefully that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And Tanisha, I didn't know how much time we needed to leave for you to wrap up. So. And you're on mute.
Not much. I think this is I think it's the start to such a good conversation. I definitely like the listening and interacting kind of with the chat conversations, because I think hearing from teachers about the questions they have and, you know, and kind of their particular situations as we go into a school year of uncertainty and newness. I think a big thing is to think about how we lean on each other and kind of learn from each other, and really also think about a way to be innovative during these times. I definitely want to appreciate both of you for this information. I know for me particularly, listening, I was kind of like writing notes, and this idea of realizing, and I said this before, I think in the first session, because it's kind of like teaching is already a complex job, and then we've kind of added another layer to it with what's going on with the world, and then a third layer of, and now we're virtual. So there's a lot for teachers to navigate during this time. And one thing, and so I think this idea of realizing that all these stresses are there and really focusing still on our students during this time, you know, is going to be key as well. you know, as well as letting, I think for me, you know, this kind of like releasing control, we're going to have a lot of patience with ourselves, with our students, you know, in order to serve them well as well. So I definitely appreciate this framework. I hope that, I hope that teachers are, you know, the wheels are turning, you know, as far as thinking about our students, thinking about how we can do the best for them, thinking about our own self-care during this time, and this idea of resisting re-traumatization, I think is clearly key as well. Um, so I'm looking in the chat. The CPDU link is in the chat. I hope it works. Um, and I see these last, Rachel's been on it the whole time, you know, as far as Sonya, you mentioned this, and I think it just to be said again, because we're shifting to this virtual learning, I can't say enough of how this is an opportunity to really engage parents in a different way, you know, than we maybe typically haven't, as well. And I think the idea of really, it still takes that personalization for our students. So it's like, you know, what we know in person is the relationships matter. In virtual learning, the relationships still matter. And sometimes I think, you know, the idea of like, it's virtual, I haven't seen them in person. And one thing that kind of helped me, I was like, well, people get married, you know, through online dating, you know, so I'm like, there's still ways to build relationships virtually. And so really kind of shifting our thinking, and being innovative, and, you know, figuring out how to make those personal connections with our students, and understanding that it's going to be key in order to, serve our students well. So I thank everyone. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, ladies, for your presentation. Thank everyone for attending today. Next Wednesday is our next session. So we hope to see everyone, next week as well.